Hello, I'm very happy to introduce a recording of the opening presentation of our 2022-2023 series of talks by local historians. The first one was entitled Researching the Norwich Strangers and is by Frank Meeres. Before I introduce Frank, let me say a quick word about his subject. The strangers are what people called the influx of refugees that came into East Anglia during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. They were mainly Protestants and they were coming from what is present-day Belgium and Netherlands, fleeing Catholic persecution. And at one point they made up over a quarter of the Norwich population. Through their weaving skills, they made a massive impact on the city's economy and increased Norwich's status nationally. They also made a significant impact on local culture, an impact that we still feel today in the way that Norfolk people speak and also in our association with Canaries. But what resources can we use if we want to understand these strangers better? This is the question that Frank Meeres sets out to explain. Frank is a prolific author about local history subjects. He worked for many years as an archivist at the Norfolk Record Office, and it is there that he gained an expert knowledge about all of the records that either were created by or referred to the strangers. He used this knowledge in his latest book, The Welcome Stranger, Dutch, Walloon and Huguenot Incomers to Norwich, 1550 to 1750. We're very thankful that Frank agreed to speak to us, and this is the presentation that he gave us.
My name is Frank Meeres. I was for many years an archivist at the Norfolk Record Office, and for a long time have been researching into the role of immigrants and refugees into the city of Norwich. I'm here talking today about the strangers. By strangers, I am using that term in the way it is used in the city to refer to a specific group of incomers, those who came from the Spanish Netherlands in the late 16th century and early 17th century and who were fleeing persecution. They were refugees arriving in the city, and at one time they were making up well over a quarter, almost a third of the population of the city of Norwich, and have left a long-term legacy in the city which is still remembered by people today. The refugees coming to Norwich were arriving from the area called the Spanish Netherlands, which, as the name implies, was under the control of Spain in the 16th century. This area embraces what we call the Netherlands today, but extends also further south into Belgium, Luxembourg, and parts of what are now regarded as northeastern France. This area was part of the Spanish Empire, but wished to break away, and in particular wished to adopt a Calvinistic religion, a Protestant religion, which the Spanish authorities would not approve of. They were firmly Roman Catholic and persecuted any Protestants they found within their dominions. And this, of course, led to many refugees fleeing the area, going into Protestant countries elsewhere in Europe, including England and including the city of Norwich itself. We know about the origins of the earliest people coming into Norwich because there's a census which I shall return to of 1568, which tells us whereabouts within the Spanish Netherlands they came from. There are actually two groups within the community in Norwich. The first and the largest being the Dutch community. They came primarily from Flanders, but with sizable numbers coming also from Brabant, Zeeland, Holland, and a few from other provinces within the Spanish Netherlands. The second group spoke French. They were known as Walloons. They came primarily from the extreme south area of the Spanish Netherlands, as shown on this map. They came from the extreme south of Flanders, the area known as Walloon Flanders, and also and primarily from Artois and Hainaut. And it was this group that formed the French-speaking refugees within Norwich. Each of the two groups had their own place of worship. The Dutch worshipped in Blackfriars Hall in Norwich. The French speakers, the Walloons, worshipped originally in the Bishop's Palace in the Close in Norwich, and later in a disused church known as St Mary the Less on Queen Street in Norwich. As the refugees came from the Low Countries into England, the Norwich authorities at first thought they could cherry-pick. They could select from the refugees those whom they would like to invite into the city of Norwich. And in June 1566, they invited 30 masters, woolen masters, into the city in the hope that they would be employing apprentices and giving a kickstart to a woolen trade in the city. These 30 are listed in the Mayor's Court book. They include 24 Dutch speakers and 6 Walloons. And some of these names do become prominent within Norwich over the next few years. They include amongst the Dutch Thomas Bateman, amongst the Walloons Noah Le Turc, and these names do show up in the Norwich records. But others amongst this group probably never came. Bear in mind, this is an invitation to the 30. An invitation is not always taken up. It's also interesting to think that many of these refugees were actually already in England. The pattern is that they came first to Sandwich and to London. These were the two earliest immigrant refugee communities, later on spreading out to other cities in England, such as Colchester, Southampton, and above all to Norwich itself. So these are original 30 invitees, not all of whom came, and in fact within a year the city was swamped by many hundreds of refugees not on this list. The city was very concerned about the number of incomers arriving in Norwich, and this is shown in the fact they conducted various head counts and censuses of these strangers. The most detailed of these is that of May 1568, which we shall look at in a moment, but many other records concern the numbers actually coming in. This is the 1571 head count, where the authorities have counted up the numbers in each ward and come to the conclusion there are 3,925 incomers, of which 868 men are from the Dutch nation, 203 men are from the Walloon nation, and just over 1,000 women when particular nations are not specified, and also a large number of children. So it says 3,925 immigrants have arrived in the city with a population of 12 to 15,000. We don't know the exact number because whereas they're forever counting the number of incomers, they do not make account of the number of natives. This is the same head count, that of 1571, looking rather different because here Roman numerals are applied rather than Arabic numbers, and this divides the incomers into a ward in which they are living. The largest number by far are living in the ward of West Weimar, which is the area we now think of as St Benedict Street in Norwich. It should be remembered, of course, that it's not a question of a mass of immigrants coming against a population of long-term residents. A place like Norwich very much depended on incomers coming in particularly from the county of Norfolk, and taking advantage of economic and social opportunities so as a continual input of newcomers into the city. But obviously the ones we're concerned with are those who are coming not from Norfolk or elsewhere in the country, but from the Low Countries and coming here because of religious persecution. This is the census of 1568, May 1568, made by orders of national government, and this survives most of the diocesan records of Norwich. This is actually in Latin rather than English. And this particular page records the number of immigrants who've come from the Low Countries as they are counted in May 1568. The list divides them here into the numbers of married people, non-married, adolescents, boys, and also widows and widowers. The number of married is actually a confusing one because that is the number 314 is the number of married couples. In fact, it embraces 628 individuals. This page is the summary of the Dutch refugees who have come into the city by 1568. Their total is in fact 1,480. A separate series of entries within this record refers to walloons for Dutch speakers who are a smaller number. There are 339 walloons recorded in this census. So these are the incomers who have come in by May 1568. This page in the 1568 census shows that this is a very neat record. It's a copy. The original was presumably sent into national authorities who ordered this census to be taken. And it records many, perhaps 2/3 of the incomers as having the occupation of woolcombers or weavers, so they're very much connected with the weaving industry. And thus this reflects the original intention of the Norwich authorities that incomers should be coming in skilled in wool trade and helping to kickstart the weaving industry within the city of Norwich. The great majority of incomers had skills within the weaving or wool combing trade and related industries like dyeing, but by no means all refugees came from that field. This particular entry within the 1568 census refers to two men who had very different skills. The top lines refer to Mr. John Crop. He was a surgeon. He came with his sister from Flanders in 1567, and he established a family of surgeons, several generations of medical men in Norwich, thus supplying a much needed skill to the city. The second line refers to Anthony de la Salem, printer, who's coming from Brabant with his wife and two boys. Salem, as is quite well known within Norwich, is the first person in the city to undertake printing of books and pamphlets. He brought the printing press with him and set himself up and became a supplier of his much needed skill, not only providing books in Dutch, also one in French, one in English, but also doing useful work like supplying handbills for the city of Norwich, for the corporation, and other related material for the Church of St Andrews within the city of Norwich. So he is supplying a new skill to the city of Norwich when he comes here as a refugee from Brabant in 1567. Mr. Crop and Anthony Salem would no doubt have been able to look after themselves financially, but some of the refugees, of course, were coming over in a desperate case. This entry was again within the 1568 census refers to Mary, wife of John Smet, who is coming over, if a wife is coming over with 7 children. In the same party, the wife unnamed of Peter de Passat is bringing 3 children. So these are people who are coming over as refugees in desperate need of help and support. The entry, the bottom 2 lines, tell you that they came from Flanders originally, but they had come via Dieppe, so there's a second stage in their fleeing from the persecution in Flanders. Firstly, they went to Dieppe. Presumably for some reasons they were not welcomed there and came on to Norwich. The entry also tells you that they came in winter. As we know from our knowledge of what goes on in the Mediterranean, what goes on in the English Channel, these refugees normally come over in the summer season, where the seas are relatively calm. The journey is, well, risky enough, is less dangerous. But these people must have been desperate because we're told that they came over in the winter. Now, these people are going to be very different from the refugees we read of today in the 21st century, because they are never going to become dependents upon the welfare systems within England, within Norwich. When these immigrants come over, if they are in need, if they are poor, they are a responsibility not of the city of Norwich, but of their own community. So that Marie would be a responsibility of the other Dutch people settled within Norwich. We can see this in that every week that they held a church service, the Dutch and the Walloon communities were raising money for the poor within their own community. And when we discuss wills, we can see that almost all the Dutch and Walloon people who are wealthy enough to leave wills leave money for the poor within their own community, so they do not become dependent upon the city charities. A final example of names from the 1568 census. The top line, Francisca, means is a widow. The second one down is a widower. He is a Lanciscus, a wool weaver. As we saw, this was the occupation of about 2/3 of these immigrants. It's interesting that Francisca means a widow had come over in 1561. That means she'd come over to England in 1561, not necessarily to Norwich. She may well have been one of those people who arrived at Sandwich or London who later on thought it preferable to come to Norwich, whereas the next one down and the following entry are arriving in Norwich probably directly. They're coming in 1567, which is a time of heavy persecution. The Spanish army had arrived in Brussels in 1567 and was vigorously persecuting Protestants there. The headcounts of refugee incomers into the city of Norwich culminated that of 1583, at which date there were 4,679 incomers. This is the highest number recorded within the various records of the city of Norwich, but it may well conceal the highest peak of all, which could have been several years earlier, because we know from other sources that over 2,000 strangers died of plague in Norwich in 1579. So it may well be that the climax, if you like, the highest number of strangers within the city was before that plague of 1579. If that is so, then the best record of the immigrants within the city is probably the subsidy roll of 1576, shown here. This is the subsidy roll for the parish of St Andrews. The subsidy roll records 3 groups of people, really. It records the English people who are wealthy enough to pay subsidy, a tax. It includes the immigrants who had sufficient wealth, sufficient property to pay tax, but it also acts as a poll tax for the many strangers, aliens they're called here, for the many aliens who had no wealth but who were obliged to pay a poll tax of 4 pence. The English were not obliged to pay this tax, so this roll becomes a record of the householders, the male householders. Amongst the immigrant community in 1576, 3 years before the Great Plague, those who were wealthy enough to pay subsidy and also a poll tax on those who were not wealthy enough to pay the subsidy, but instead had to pay their 4 pence. So this becomes a very important record detailing the names of the heads of the households of the stranger community in the years before the Great Plague caused a loss of 2,000 members of the stranger community to the plague. This is another section of the 1576 subsidy showing the payments made. You can see the name of Thomas Bateman at the top. We mentioned him earlier as being one of those invited in 1566. So he obviously came, he's obviously still here 10 years later, and he is paying tax on his property within the city. Also on this list you can see the name of John Crop, alien, a surgeon we have already mentioned, who appears in the 1568 census, and he again is paying tax on his wealth within the city. Another name right at the bottom, Nicholas van Verken, alien, paying on his tax on his goods. We shall mention him again later in another context. As the 1568 census shows, the great majority of these aliens, about 2/3, were employed in the weaving industry. Another way we can see the importance of the weavers within the city of Norwich is in relation to the regulations applying to weavers. These were made in 1574, and the document is in English, but there's also an exact parallel document shown here in Dutch. So the Dutch community, the contribution to weaving was so great that the regulations for weaving were issued both in English and in Dutch. Question there applies to what about the Walloon or Welsh French-speaking community, I should say, the French-speaking community. If ever a French version of the orders was made, it does not survive, we just don't know, but the regulations exist in English and in Dutch. And this is a further page from those regulations showing how each rule, and these are rules about how you presented your cloth, where you sold it, and in its nature and its fabrics. It should be remembered that the Dutch and the Walloons were bringing in new skills. This is one reason why they would be welcomed into the city. They would present new, lighter types of fabric, brighter colours. Several of the incomes were dyers who would dye the cloth. And this, of course, made them popular within the city and within England as a whole. Incomes were arriving in the city at several periods between 1560 and maybe 1608. But of course, there wasn't war at all the time throughout those periods. There were times, especially the north of the Spanish Netherlands, the area we now think of as Holland, was relatively well established as a peaceful community. There would be other times when the Spanish would be trying to conquer it and creating, no doubt, more refugees. In relatively peaceful times, people could trade between Norwich and the Spanish Netherlands, and examples of that do show up in law records, legal records within the city of Norwich. For example, this is a record relating to Malleus Rickwood. In 1593, he was able to trade between Norwich and Rotterdam, and this is a legal case arising because of an import of some silk which he had arranged from Rotterdam coming into Norwich, and which was thought to be substandard, thus creating the legal case and creating records which have survived amongst the city archives down to the present day. One of the most fascinating forms of documents which give us a lot of information about the life of these incomers within the city of Norwich are the wills. Obviously, a lot of them were too poor to be leaving wills, but those who had sufficient wealth might well do so. This is the will of Loiskin Rockegem, who is a lady, a female member of the Dutch refugee community, and in her will she details all her goods and hands them out. These are very personal items like hose and cloaks, and she names the people to whom she would like them to go. So this is almost like a probate inventory in its detail and give us an insight into the living standards of the refugee community in Norwich. The originals that survive amongst probate records include not just those of the Dutch, but also those of the Walloons. And it is interesting to note that many of the immigrants were not able to make a will in English. They made their wills in their native tongue, be it Dutch or be it French. And these wills survive amongst the probate records, where they are also survive in translations into English made by the local governors of the immigrant communities who are known as the politic men, and they translated these wills. So that you have quite a body of French and Dutch texts from the late 16th, early 17th century within the Norwich Probate Archive. This will is of Adrian de la May. This is the English version, and he is a Walloon, a French speaker, and his will also survives in French. Alongside the wills, you sometimes get probate inventories for the incomer community. These list all the property and items that they owned at the time of their death. This is a probate inventory for Martin Bolden in April 1594. There's nothing on this inventory to say that he actually was an incomer, a refugee, but we know from other sources that he was. It lists his goods room by room. The first heading here says in the parlour, so we're getting a list of property that he had in the parlour, mainly items related to his trade as a weaver, in this case mostly pairs of scales and weights. But also it interests other property that he owns. For example, here in the bottom line is a reference to a psalm book and a Bible and to 6 other books. So with these probate inventories, you're getting enormously detailed impression of what life was like for the more wealthy members of the refugee community in Norwich in the later 16th and early 17th century. This is another example of a probate inventory, in this case of a woman, and records all the clothing which she left. And this indicates that there's some way of differentiating English clothing from Dutch clothing, because on here there are references to Dutch hats, Dutch hood, Dutch cloak, Flemish cloak. So again, you're getting an impression of the possessions of the immigrant community living within the city of Norwich. And relative wealth and value. Of course, the greater majority of incomers, as with the English people themselves, would not be of sufficient wealth for them to have wills or for probate inventories to be made of their possessions. But where they are made, most of relatively wealthy and prosperous members of the community, you're getting a good flavour of what life was like for them and what possessions they had, and you get plenty of bling, for example, in these records of jewels, silver spoons, and other treasures preserved amongst the Dutch community and the Walloon community within the city of Norwich. In Tudor and Stuart Norwich, every male had to parade every year in the musters, and they had to display any kind of weapons, furniture as it's called in the archives, that they possessed. From 1595, you get separate lists for musters of the Dutch and the Walloon communities, and these are useful as recording the names of all the adult males within each group and giving some impression of their relative wealth. This is a 1595 musters entry for the Dutch community, and you can see the first 4 or 5 names are possessors of muskets. Others have lesser items. Amongst the names on this page, you can see John Crop, again entitled Mr. Magister John Crop, who is recorded as having a musket. You can also see beside his name in a later hand the word deaf, D-E-F, defunct, meaning he's now died, so he's died between the drawing up of his list and the actual presentation of the muster. Another name you can see here is Jacques de Hem, who is in fact one of the wealthiest members of the Dutch community. He worships at St. Michael at Plea, and if you go to St. Michael at Plea, you can find several monuments to the de Hem family within that church. On the wall is a monument to his wife, who died giving birth to her 10th child in 1603, another plague year. After her death in 1603, Jacques married again and had several more children. He himself eventually died, and there's a floor monument to him in St. Michael at Plea. One of his sons, Tobias, is also recorded as being buried at St. Michael at Plea. And Tobias is interesting as an example of that merging together of the immigrant community and the English community, because Tobias married an English woman, as did quite a large number of these immigrants, especially of the second generation, and thus gives rise to the supposition often made in Norwich, where families very commonly say, "Oh, we think we have a stranger amongst our ancestors, amongst our line of our family tree." And in very many cases, they are probably right. This is a summary of the contribution of the Dutch and Walloon immigrant refugee community to the musters within Norwich in the year 1595. It tells that the people who were called up to muster were the people aged between 16 and 60, presumably excepting any who were physically or mentally incapable of bearing arms, but including the great majority of adult males within the community. It's a comparison of these records with the numbers of English bearing arms that tells us that at this date, 1595, well over a quarter, almost a third, of the adult male arm-bearing members of society in Norwich were refugees, the Dutchmen and Walloons. The figures given here look a bit odd. They're in Roman numerals. The Dutch are given as 400, the Walloons as 355. This is in 1595 and indicates, I think, that the number of Walloons, or the proportion of Walloons within the refugee community, is growing, and indeed by the early years of the 17th century, there are perhaps as many or even more Walloons than there are Dutch members of the community. One obvious reason for this is that the Dutch were relatively able to go back to their own area within the Spanish Netherlands as it became increasingly liberated, if you like, from the Spanish, whereas the Walloon parts, the extreme south of the Spanish Netherlands, remained under the control of Spain, and therefore Protestants were continually being persecuted there. So therefore the number of Walloons who were able to go home was much fewer than the number of Dutchmen who were choosing to go home. In Norwich in the 16th century, there were about 35 Anglican parish churches, and these were where all the people within the city would go every Sunday. There were no non-conformist churches. That's a later innovation. So everybody would be going, and they'd have to go to their local Anglican parish church. The only two exceptions were the churches we've already mentioned, the church for the Dutch community and the French-speaking church for the Walloon community. One great innovation for record keeping in the 16th century is the start of the parish register, which survive in theory at least from 1538 when they were first innovated, and should record the names of baptisms, marriages and burials of every person in England, as every person in England had to go to the Anglican parish church. Exceptions to this were, the only exceptions, were the two immigrant communities, and they maintained their own parish registers of baptisms and of marriages. Those survive. They are not complete, but they do survive for various periods from the later 16th century onwards. However, there's no provision for burials, so there's no burial yard in either of those community churches, so the immigrants, when they died, were buried in the local parish church and in theory recorded in the local parish church register. This recording varies enormously. I've looked at just about all the surviving burial registers from the 16th century. Sometimes you get very poor recording. You get just something like 15 Walloons were buried this year, 15 Walloons, 4 Dutchmen buried last week of plague, entries like that. Other parishes do go so far as to record the actual names, give the dignity in death of the immigrant refugee. This is the parish register for St Michael at Plea. This is in the year 1579, a plague year, so there are many more entries for this parish in terms of burials in 1579 than there were in the years before, or indeed the years immediately after. This is a close-up of the parish burial register for St Michael at Plea, showing the names of some of the Dutch community who died during that year, probably of plague, though it's not stated in no burial register. This date is the cause of death given. The top entry here, top left, refers to David Bartringham, the son of William the Painter, Dutchman, and he was buried at the end of August in 1579. And of course that word painter invites various questions. Was he an artist? Was he a house painter? Whoever he was, he did not live very long after his son, as the bottom entry on the left-hand column refers to William Bartringham himself. William Bartringham, a painter, Dutchman, buried on the 30th day of August. And there are also, sadly, records of two other children of William Bartringham in this same page, so they are probably dying of plague in St Michael-at-Plea in 1579, but at least unlike in many other parish church records of this date, they are being allowed to have their names recorded within the parish registers, not just the numbers of Dutch or Walloons who have died. In the right-hand side, near the bottom, you can see Nicholas van Werven. We mentioned him earlier. Now he's been buried in November 1579, possibly of plague, it's not stated. You will recall that he recurred in the 1576 subsidy. So that he's an example of where several different records of one person combined to give us a flavour of his life. In 1576, he was a wealthy and prosperous merchant. Here in November 1579, he is dying, possibly of plague, but certainly being buried in the churchyard of St Michael-at-Plea in Norwich. As we've seen, the largest of the headcounts of the refugees within Norwich was that of 1583, when 4,679 people are recorded, and that may well, as we have seen, not be the high point, as over 2,000 had died of plague 4 years earlier in 1579. The very fact they don't make any headcounts after 1583 may indicate that the time of a great wave of immigrants into Norwich was over. They were no longer panicking about the numbers of people coming in. In fact, there was no more headcounts were made until 1622, when a national survey was made of the immigrant communities, no doubt primarily for taxation purposes. This is not held in the Record Office, unlike all the other archives I've shown you so far, but in the National Archives. I have extracted from it the 10 wealthiest members of the immigrant community in Norwich as they were in 1622. And this gives you a flavour of the kind of occupations that they were employed in within the city. You can see several merchants, quite a large number of hosiers. So these are people making hose, not garden hose, of course, but tights, stockings. And Norwich was regarded as one of the main centres in the Great Britain where hose was made. And you can see several members of the immigrant community making themselves wealthy through this industry. You'll notice on there the name Tobias de Hem, whom I already mentioned, who is one of the merchants within the immigrant community. Elias de Bonny, a weaver, probably a master weaver, employing other weavers to obtain his very respectable wealth of £4. You will also notice at least two of these men are gardeners, including the wealthiest, Maliard Widut, husbandman and gardener. He is also the only person on the entire list of the 1622 record of incomers who doesn't live within the city itself, within one of the parishes in Norwich, but who live just outside the walls of Trouse and Carrow, where he presumably has property, where he indulges in his role as husbandman and gardener. The Dutch were famous for their love of gardening. There were gardeners even included in the very earliest census I've already mentioned of 1568 has 2 gardeners within it, one of whom was later employed to do the gardens at a country house in Suffolk called Hengrave Hall. And the Dutch are always said to have brought with them the tulip, originally I believe from Turkey, and a love of gardens and gardening, which became adopted by Norwich people. So that in the 1630s there were what are called florists' feasts, hard to say that, in St Andrew's Hall in Norwich, which were no doubt the equivalent of the Chelsea Flower Show of their day, and popular amongst both the incomer community and the native English community. In the same way, the Dutch brought with them other attributes which were adopted by the English. The very word plain, for example, means in Dutch open space, and is the word used in Norwich for plains, for open spaces like Bank Plain, St Andrew's Plain, and in the 20th century, Millennium Plain, which was obviously adopted by the city authorities in tribute to the naming of the open spaces by the Dutch several centuries earlier. Millennium Plain, just outside the library rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1994, the Great Library Fire, and so named as a celebration of the contribution of the Dutch community to the legacy of the city. As we have seen, many of the Dutch immigrants, refugees, were weavers, and one thing they brought with them was their favourite pet, the canary, introduced originally to the Low Countries from the Canary Islands. Weaving was mainly conducted not in factories, but in the attics of private houses. You get often in Norwich, you can still see that the windows of the attics of old houses have been opened up to create more light, bring light into the loom. And the people who would sit at those looms would be weaving, they would be bored, they would not have Radio 4 in those days, but what they would do, they would follow on the idea introduced by the Dutch of having the company of a canary in the cage to chirp away while they worked. It was an idea introduced by the Dutch. This became very popular amongst the English themselves, so that in the 18th and above all in the 19th century, Norwich people are very keen on having canaries as pets. They even develop their own breed of canary, and if you look in 19th century newspapers, you can see column after column of canary shows, recorded prize winners' names enlisted in the newspaper. And this obviously continues to the 20th century, 21st century, where the Norwich City Football Club proudly displays the logo of a canary. It is, I would guess, the only football team within Britain whose logo embraces the legacy of incomers, of refugees into the home city of many centuries earlier, preserved in the logo today, Norwich City, the Canaries. Thank you.